History has given humans some of the most intriguing stories and personalities that every present time can study from, learn from, and use as catalyst to step out of the mediocrity of most of our minds, as these historical events are capable of challenging our imaginations into thinking beyond the shallow thoughts we are burdened with in our everyday lives, and make us encapsulate dreams far beyond our peers and position. But unfortunately, we are too comfortable exactly where we are. Oh well. What's up, amazing people of this weird planet called Earth? Welcome to episode 34 of History's Most Influential Humans podcast with yours truly, Damilare Mapa. Today we'll be going to England to study one of its history's most controversial figures and how he had a dream that never really lasted long. His name is Oliver Cromwell. Okay, so worthy to note, there were a lot of foreign terms and terminologies I encountered in gathering the information of today's influential human. So I'd be summarizing his story in a way that anyone who listens can understand. So let's begin. Little is known about his earlier years, so we won't dive too much into that. The fifth of 10 children and the only male survivor after infancy. He was born on 25th April 1599 to Robert Cromwell and his second wife Elizabeth. Oliver Cromwell attended Huntingdon Grammar School and went on to study at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, although he left the school without a degree when his father died. When Cromwell was growing up, the King of England on the throne then was known as James I. But on March 27, 1625, when Oliver was about 25 years old, James I died, and then his son Charles I inherited the throne. Well, they were just two different people and lives, but apparently destiny had some other relationship prepared for them in the future. I mean Charles and Oliver, by the way. Charles I had a lot of characteristics that made him seem like a tyrant king, as he was said to spend taxpayers' money on irrelevant things. So Oliver Cromwell, dissatisfied with this, killed the king. Wait, no, that's not exactly how it happened actually, but I'll summarize the story in a way you'd understand. At a point in Cromwell's life, he was plagued by what people described as staunch depression, which almost took his life. He described himself as a chronic sinner, but somehow he recovered from this stage of his life. He described this stage as emerging from darkness into light, the light of Puritanism. Puritanism is a group of English Protestant Christianity faiths with a few different ideas and principles as opposed to the other English Catholic faith, which Cromwell didn't like too much, but was supported by the king, Charles I. His wife was also a Catholic, so yeah, it was like they were opposites. So Charles was always forming different parliaments during his rule, only to justify his raising taxes. But anytime the representatives of each region went against his wish, he would always dissolve the parliament again and again, which he did so many times. So Oliver Cromwell joined parliament in 1628, but this was short-lived as the king, Charles I, because of some silly reasons, dissolved parliament for about 11 years this time, March 1629 to April 1640. During the time which Cromwell had lost all his influential connections and became broke, but he struck luck when one of his childless uncles from his mother's side died in 1636 and he inherited all his wealth. In 1640, Charles decided to call for a parliament because he was broke after fighting an irrelevant war with Scotland. The parliament didn't last for more than 3 weeks before the funny king, Charles I, dissolved it, and that was called the Short Parliament, by the way. But because he was still broke, he called for yet another parliament just 6 months later. But this time, the parliament accused the king's advisors of treason, so he couldn't dissolve parliament without their consent. Thus, this parliament was called the Long Parliament. Oliver Cromwell was a strong part of this long parliament representing Cambridge. He began a series of direct tackle against the king's ideals and laws, which made him quite noticeable and popular. In 1641, things weren't going too well for Charles I, as the parliament he set up to get him out of his messes expressed their dissatisfaction towards his rule using a document named the Grand Remonstrance. Charles didn't take this too well, so he decided to go arrest 5 prominent members of the parliament on January 4, 1642. He couldn't find them there though, and this was one of the prerequisites to what would start the First English Civil War. In March 1642, Parliament voted to raise an army. Charles went to London and started raising his own army. In August 1642, the First English War began. This was when it was Cromwell's time to shine, which he did very effectively. To summarize the events that happened aftermath, through a series of wars, Cromwell and his personal troops proved to be the most effective tool for the parliament to win the war against King Charles, which later ended in 1646, forcing the once King Charles of England to flee to Scotland, his former enemies. Those ones giving back to the parliament in England. All Cromwell wanted was to make sure there were structures in place that wouldn't give the king the power to raise taxes whenever he wanted and dissolve parliament whenever he wishes. So he told the parliament to cut a deal with Charles, but King Charles was too stubborn to accept any deal, and very ignorantly and probably foolishly went back to the Scots to make a deal with them to invade England. But this would end very badly as the embarrassing Second English Civil War. Well, embarrassing to Charles though. When they found out about Charles' action, he was tried and then sentenced to death by beheading. Extremely painful, but for some people, justified. Only 59 members of parliament had the courage to put their names on the executional order. But history would remember only one name: Oliver Cromwell. Okay, so one last thing this controversial man did with his very powerful army was crush a rebellion from Ireland in 1650. Although the fact that his soldiers massacred both soldiers and civilians, killing thousands of people, is something that made him hated by so many people, especially in the history of Ireland. He came back to England in 1650 to meet another war, the Third English Civil War, spearheaded by Charles' son, Charles II, who made another deal with the Scots to invade England. Those Scots are stubborn. And in September 1651, Cromwell defeated the Scots, and that was the end of all the civil wars. Well, for me, this marked the end of the most significant and controversial reasons Oliver Cromwell was an influential man. After all the wars, even with the mighty power he had, Cromwell still wanted a constitutional government that didn't give one man all the power. But after he tried this a few different times without success, probably tired, he later crowned himself king and did the things that he also blamed the dead king Charles I of doing. How ironical. On September 3rd, 1658, about 7 years after all civil wars had ended, Oliver Cromwell died naturally without really achieving what he stressed so much about in his lifetime before power. And within 2 years of his death, all his structures had collapsed, as a conventional parliament in 1660 voted to restore Charles II to the throne. That's the son of Charles I that Cromwell killed. Well, not necessarily him that killed, you get what I'm trying to say. So now this is more ironic. Oh well. One last really weird thing before we go though. After Charles II became king, as revenge for his father's death, he ordered they behead the dead buried body of Oliver mounted his head on a spike, and put it in front of like an historical place in the city. His lifeless head, that's Oliver Cromwell's head, went through a really funny, bizarre and weird almost 300 journey before finally being buried back with his body on 25th March 1916. You can go and check like that funny story, by the way. So, well, that's it on today's episode of History's Most Influential Humans podcast. I hope you learned a lot. Please, if you would not mind, follow me on my social media handles and kindly drop a feedback in the DM. I'd really appreciate it. I hope you have an amazing July, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. First Saturday of August, hopefully. Peace.